Is there a particular political or ideological agenda that's driving and pushing education in the United States? Is the public school system, for example, trying to indoctrinate or brainwash your child into believing certain things, let's say about politics or about history? These are the questions that have long been on my mind as an educator. For those of you who don't know, I've been an educator for the past 10 years. This is my 11th year of teaching. And this is one of those, I cover conspiracy theories on this channel. And this is one of the conspiracy theories that has kind of been lying beneath the surface since I've started teaching. But over really the past 5, 6 years has kind of come to the forefront, and I've had not only students, but parents kind of bring this concern to me. And it often even comes up in job interviews that I have. I'm asked how I teach as a history teacher. I'm asked how I teach and how I approach certain subjects and how I approach handling certain situations in the classroom that will inevitably arrive when I teach something like the American Civil War, when I talk about something like the history of slavery from both students and parents. And I still remember the first time that this was really brought to me by an adult. Now, I've had a lot of students kind of ask questions in class, and I've had students approach me after class and ask me, well, what do you think about this position? Or what do you think about that position? But I vividly recall this was, I can't say vividly if I can't remember exactly how long ago it was, but I live in South Georgia. I live in Savannah, and we had to evacuate one year for a hurricane. And I was staying with some family members of my wife who I didn't really know. And so we all had to evacuate. And I remember we were having dinner, and the father of my wife's cousin, I was having a conversation with him because inevitably the conversation arises. Oh, like, so what are you up to nowadays? And I was teaching. And at the time, I was teaching at a public tech school. And so he was asking, well, you teach history. Like, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? And we were having a conversation about that. And we were talking about the American Civil War because we live in the South. There's a lot of historical Civil War sites. It's an area of history that people are generally interested in. And he asked me what I thought about the Civil War in terms of what I thought the causes of the Civil War was. And so inevitably we got into a conversation about the history and the institution of American slavery. And, I could tell that he was just kind of moderately interested in it. We were just kind of having semi polite conversation over dinner. So I gave like a high level overview and just talked kind of briefly to gauge exactly how interested he was in what I had to say. Maybe he was just asking it to be polite and wanted to continue on with talking about whatever. I wanted to be mindful that not everybody wants to spend a couple hours talking about history like I would want to. But in response to me talking about the history of slavery, his response was something along the lines of, well, of course you would say that. That's what they want you to say. So I spent some more time unpacking that because that was just kind of an odd statement, and no one had at that point, no one had really said that sort of thing to me. And the impression that I got was, and why I say like this sort of conservative conspiracy that education is intended to indoctrinate or persuade people of a certain political position, this is what came to the forefront. He said that he told me that me as a history teacher, that I was trying to convince people to think a certain way, not historically. Now, obviously, as a teacher, I'm relaying information and we're talking about history as a subject, but that politically, I'm there and I'm being paid to convince people. And it really caught me off guard. Like, on one hand, what I told him, like, yes, I am paid by the state. It's a public university. It's publicly funded and backed to a certain degree by taxpayer dollars. So yes, I am paid by the state, but I'm paid to teach a set curriculum. Like, I don't get to teach I'm not teaching my opinion about the Civil War, or I'm not teaching my particular political persuasion when it comes to the history of slavery. All of this stuff is fairly concrete. I mean, yes, the history of slavery is an active research area for historians, but the fact that slavery happened and the ramifications and implications of the institution of slavery and how it's impacted US history over the past 250-ish years is not really a subject of debate, so to speak. And so I've heard this, and I'm calling this a conspiracy because the belief here, one of the common features of a conspiracy theory is that there's some sort of actors behind the scenes that are pulling the strings in order to accomplish some sort of nefarious goal. And the nefarious goal in this conspiracy, education conspiracy, is that there are people behind the scenes trying to corrupt your children, to corrupt the minds of the youth, to reference back to Socrates there. And this came to my mind as I was watching a news article, a news video, I should say, put out by the Wall Street Journal about a new university that has opened its doors, the University of Austin. And the University of Austin was founded kind of as a counteraction against this perceived wokeness on the left. This is my left. On the left, so to speak, and that they want to establish a place where free speech and freedom of expression is encouraged and is encouraged amongst the student body. And what caught my attention here was an instructor that's teaching a course called The Legacy of Slavery, which we're going to get to, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of the video.
School promoting free speech that has sparked both excitement and controversy.
American academics has become corrupt, and our goal is to change that.
But success.
So American academics has become corrupt in the sense that I get from watching the whole video, and I'll link the video in the description of this video and some of the articles that I've read. The idea here is that it's become corrupt in the sense that American higher education, we're talking about college here, is limiting free speech, limiting free expression, and that as a result, the students who attend these universities don't feel comfortable expressing their opinions. And the conspiratorial aspect here is that the university as a whole is trying to get them to conform and to think in a certain way that is politically motivated. Now, this is at times difficult to parse out because on the one hand, and this is a bigger conversation that kind of transcends the confines of this video, but on the one hand, like, yes, education is trying to get you to think in a certain way, but that's not the reason why I'm calling this a conspiracy. Is that the conspiracy is that they're trying to get you to think in this case, my perception is that they're trying to get you to think like a quote unquote good liberal, or that they are censoring certain subject matters, they're censoring certain topics in order to get you to believe certain political points, is the impression that I get. But let me get to the part that actually caught my attention.
What they think.
That academic freedom is part of what attracted Professor Coleman Hughes to UATX. He's teaching a course called The Legacy of Slavery.
At most elite universities, in a course on that topic, you would not read the body of work of, say, Thomas Sowell.
Okay, so they start off with this interview of Coleman Hughes. They call him Professor Coleman Hughes. He does not have a background in education, and from what I can tell from his Wikipedia, his highest degree awarded is a BA in philosophy. So out the gate, I'm not quite sure why he's teaching a college class. For most universities, the minimum requirement to be an instructor is bare minimum a master's degree in the subject area. This is a private university, so they can typically waive those standards. But for example, for the state of Georgia, if you're going to teach a college class, bare minimum is a master's degree. And for most full-time professors, it's typically expected that you have a doctorate or that you're about to complete your doctorate. just to throw that out there. And to the point that's raised, at most elite universities, I would just even say at most universities, if there's a class on the legacy of slavery, and if by legacy of slavery, Professor Hughes means the history of slavery, that you would not read the work of Thomas Sowell, my response to that is yes. Why wouldn't you read the work of Thomas Sowell? And the answer to that question is because Thomas Sowell is not a historian. Thomas Sowell is an economist who also writes about political issues. And the book that's referenced in this, that will be shown in this video, is a book not about history, it's a book about politics. So, yeah, why would you read that in a course about the history of slavery? It's framed in such a way that this book is being intentionally ignored by historians or by the history curriculum. But in reality, that would be the equivalent of me asking, why are the Twilight books not read in American history class? Well, because it's a work of literature. Now, maybe that's a little bit unfair because there is a lot of overlap between economics and history, to be sure. Maybe a better example would be, why are Bill O'Reilly's books about history not read in a history class? And that's because there's a certain standard when it comes to history classes, standard in terms of content, in terms of the textbooks that are used in most history classes that are reflecting on slavery are going to reflect the work of historians who specialize in the history of slavery. And if we're talking about general level undergraduate classes, you're not really going to usually read individual books. You're usually just going to read some standard textbook. For example, this is the textbook that I use for my history class, Patterns of World History, Volume 1 and 2. And this is the textbook that was used for when I taught American history, America, a Narrative History, volumes 1 and 2. It's just a general standard textbook. So yeah, you're not going to read the works of people like Thomas Sowell, but that's not because academia at large is trying to censor Thomas Sowell.
He gives an overview of the global history of slavery, not narrowly tailored to the United States. Most American high school students graduate believing that slavery was basically confined to the United States, when really that represents less than 1% of slavery broadly construed over the history of Earth. Just to give an example, in my class.
So this is the part that really stood out to me, and this is really the impetus for me making this video, because I think this is reflective of the sort of conspiracy theory that I mentioned at the beginning, that certain parts of history are intentionally left out, or that we're only teaching certain things over and against another. Hughes raises the point that for most high schoolers, so we switched from talking about college students to talking about high school students, that most high school students are only taught history through the lens of American slavery. Part of what makes this persuasive to some extent is, if you think back to your own history education, you probably don't remember learning about the history of slavery other than American slavery. So, on the one hand, part of what Professor Hughes is saying is partially true, but it's also very misleading. Now, the high school curriculum tends to vary from state to state, but generally speaking, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a Georgia teacher here, there are usually 3 required history classes or history courses that all students must take in high school. And generally, this boils down to some sort of world history. At the high school level, this is usually taught in like 9th or 10th grade, and world history 1 and 2 are usually combined together. American history, and then usually a combination of American civics or economics, or in some places like Georgia, there's been a tendency to combine American civics with American history and to teach both of those as one class. On top of that, in states like Georgia, you have programs called Move On When Ready, which allows high school students to take college classes for free of cost. And generally, the idea is that they want high school students to take their basic core classes, core college classes, to go ahead and receive that college credit. So that way, once they enter college, they can finish quicker than they normally would. And in my experience, and I'm talking about my personal experience from what I've seen in Georgia education specifically, so take this with a grain of salt. Usually what happens is high schoolers don't really take high school history. They may take world history, but a lot of the high schoolers that I've taught in my college classes are kind of pushed into the college class because the high school isn't offering the history classes. And that's not some sort of conspiracy. They're not doing that to withhold historical information. They're doing that because they don't want to hire history teachers. History teachers are kind of at the bottom of the teaching totem pole when it comes through K through 12 education. But Professor Hughes is presenting this as if education is limiting this information, that we are intentionally not teaching people the global context of slavery. I would love for high school students to learn about the global context of slavery. But the real political issue here is the reason why they're not teaching them that is because that would mean that they would, one, have to offer more history classes. And two, if we're offering more history classes, we have to hire more history teachers. And a lot of K through 12 schools just aren't going to do that because the emphasis with standardization and standardized testing, the emphasis is on math and reading and not history. So history becomes of secondary importance. And so we're going to funnel kids to go ahead and get them to take the college classes, and as a result offer less high school history classes. But what's also worrisome about what Professor Hughes is saying here is that he presents this as a problem for a lack of historical knowledge. But if you pay attention to what he says later in the video, and I've tried to do some research and I couldn't really find much information about this class. I would love, for example, to see the syllabus for this course. This seems to be a very new course, and Professor Hughes, I think, was hired only a few months ago at the time that I recorded this video. So there's not really a lot of information out about what's covered in the class and what the syllabus is, other than the books that he mentions in this video. And the books that he mentions in this video, oddly enough or ironically enough, are books about politics and are books written from more so a political perspective about how the history of slavery is taught, or about how slavery is utilized in political discourse, and it's not history books. So my question for Professor Hughes, especially on the off chance that Professor Hughes sees this video, is if you want people to learn about the history of slavery, and okay, you want people to learn about the history of global slavery, why not teach a class on ancient slavery? Why not teach a class on slavery in the Greek world, slavery in the Roman Empire, slavery in Mesoamerica, slavery in ancient China, whatever? Why not teach those classes? Why teach a class where the focus is not on history, but on politics? Anyway, those are the questions that came to my mind. I would be curious to hear what you think about this topic, what you think about the University of Austin, the school that was started, or about Professor Hughes or his work. And I will let me know what you think. And yeah, I'll see you all next time.